Awesome. Well, Brian, welcome to the Attainment podcast.
Thanks, David. I'm delighted to be here.
All right. So, quick intro by you, Brian, if you don't mind. I'll make it quick, but there's a lot to cover here. So, folks, today's guest is Brian Byrne. He's founder and CEO of Aviador Group. That's a global strategic advisory firm that's worked with leadership teams in over 60 countries to compete under extreme market pressure. Before launching Aviador in 2000, Brian spent 16 years in leadership roles at Kraft Foods, where he led brand strategy and consumer marketing across multiple billion-dollar portfolios. He then served as VP at Citibank, overseeing the U.S. and international business innovation, and later as VP at MetLife, helping lead cultural and operational change during the company's IPO. He's advised Fortune 500 private equity firms and elite consulting teams from McKinsey to Bain. His Wargaming method is part business simulation, part battlefield rehearsal, helping companies uncover blind spots and pressure tested strategies before they go to market. So with gold hitting all-time highs and global uncertainty rising, now I think is the perfect time to hear Brian's frameworks, because they really help leaders, I think more strategically, activate faster, and win in a volatile world. So Brian, once again, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, so Brian, you're probably one of the biggest gold bugs that I know. And,
Don't tell anyone.
And gold just hit an all-time high. I mean, the chart's just gone vertical. So I'm just curious, to learn from you. What's happening? What's going on with gold?
Yeah, David,
a lot of people are scratching their heads.
Yeah. So what's happening is it's not so much that gold and silver and platinum are going up. It's the fact that fiat money is going down. So the reality is gold in particular for 5,000 years has been real money and a store of wealth. Everything else, the paper, which by the way, paper money, do you know who invented paper money?
The French?
No, East.
China.
China invented paper
Okay.
money, which I always find very ironic given what's going on right now. China, of course, is buying gold hand over fist through its central bank. But I think what's going on now, gold in particular is always a signal of geopolitical, I might say, unrest or change or radical transformation. And we are at the beginning of a war cycle. There's no question about that. And by the way, I recommend everybody always keep a little library, like 2 or 3 key books. This one here, The Fourth Turning, Ghost and How. I refer to this in every single war game introduction that I do. Martin Armstrong, who you know, Armstrong Economics, and this book predicted that we would go into a war cycle between 2020 and 2022. And guess what happened in March 2022 with Russia? So gold is pretty much it's a strong indicator of conflict, and we're in a resource conflict situation right now. The wars are really about AI supremacy, about resources, about dominance geopolitically, and gold loves that. Gold responds to that. Silver, on the other hand, is more of a monetary metal. So silver, I don't have any in front of me right now, but imagine this is silver. In the medieval times, this is what people bought food with and bartered with. So the two play different roles. Gold's store of wealth, silver's monetary metal. Yeah, they just did that. Yeah, and furthermore, there's about 6 other states that adopted gold backs. Do you know what gold backs are? Gold backs are, I have yet to buy one. I will on my next trip down there because I think they're in Florida now. Gold backs are this really cool polymer note with gold embedded right into the polymer itself. And actually you can melt the bill and pull your gold out whenever you want. Gold backs are legal tender in Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and I think Florida might have them too. I'm not sure. Every state is looking at them. So this is what I call a weak signal. It's like a leading indicator of what's to come. So some people, if you saw the movie Civil War, I'm a big movie buff, and movies are always predictive programming. They kind of herald what is to come. So I saw Civil War 2 years ago. And did you see it? Funny, that movie kind of came and went. It got good reviews, by the way. But what was brilliant about that movie is they didn't get into any of the politics. And I like to avoid politics myself. But what they did show is the aftermath of some major change, major blow up. And there's a funny segment in a gas station where they're driving up to DC for some big summit or whatever. And they go to get gas. And the gas station attendant refuses US dollars. And then they reach into their pocket and they pull out Canadian dollars. And he nods and says, I'll take that. Thank you. So, like that might mean something. Maybe Canada will get a gold-backed currency first. We don't know.
Hey everyone, just a quick note from me. You probably noticed that my side of the conversation is mostly missing by now. Unfortunately, we had a recording failure on my end, and Riverside, the podcast platform that I was using, could not recover the files. So what you're hearing now is largely Brian's perspective, but it's packed with so much insight, so I definitely still had to share it. Think of it as a solo masterclass from one of the sharpest strategy minds I've met. All right, let's get back to it. Enjoy.
Yes, they do. So they come in different denominations, much like normal fiat money. But what people are doing more and more now, aside from the gold backs, they're buying fractional gold and silver, so smaller denominations of gold. So, you can't buy a loaf of bread with a Krugerrand. Well, you could, but that the baker would be getting the better end of that deal. So people are looking at a range of things, like even junk silver, which in Canada is any silver before 1966, has pretty high silver content in it. People are hoarding that hand over fist, believe it or not. My dad used to do that. That's where I got my DNA for this stuff comes from dad, and he lived through the Depression, and he was a big coin collector, actually. Yeah, well, in by the way, they were from a upper middle class family. They did pretty well because they had land. My grandfather was head of the Department of Highways between London, Ontario, and Windsor. So he had money coming in, and they had food, and they could grow food. But still, times were tough. Yeah. Yeah, my dad was he had this big reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he'd tape everything, like everything from JFK to Watergate to the thing that really angered him most is when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. I remember him getting, like, he was at the kitchen table and he slammed his fist down because he knew, like, it was a rug pull. It was a rug pull on monetary value. So yeah, that's why. By the way, it's some of what we'll talk about today is mind shifts. People have to really shift their mindset about what has value and what does not have value. So I agree. Like my first big bonus on Wall Street in 1990, what I call a big bonus anyway, 1998 was 100K US. And I thought, wow, I've got this in my hand, and I put it into annuity and forgot about it. But when you think about that 100K now, it's what do you buy with that? You know, I mean, you can still buy things, but it's nowhere near what it was worth back then. And that was 27 years ago. So yeah, yep. Yeah. In fact, gold back then, I think was around, what, 300? I want to say 300, 200 or so an ounce. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, one thing I recommend to people and your listeners, your viewers, is do a tour of the Royal Canadian Mint in Ottawa. It's something that'll make every Canadian really proud, and it'll fill in a lot of the blanks. So when you go through the RCM, which is still minting, by the way, like all bars, bullion bars and coin, they do coinage for, I think, 50 some countries around the world and the Caribbean and all over the place. They will tell you that there is now 2 million in US dollars in the ground for every single Canadian. So that's gold, silver, copper, earths, which we'll talk about later maybe, because I've got some interesting ideas on that. But when you go through that mint, and then they have that giant coin of the Queen. Have you seen that? There's like, I think they minted three of them. And one of them, I don't know whether it's Rupert Murdoch, somebody bought it, but they have it on display, the one they kept. And that coin requires special security because they're worried about a Ocean's 11 type heist. But that mint is really fascinating. It tells you the history of money in Canada all the way back to the Dominion of Canada days, British North America Act and all that, right through modern day. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. It's really, really a great tour. That's one of them, but I think the greater reason, the Americans are very. I should confess, by the way, I'm a dual citizen, so I'll get that out of the way. I think you knew that. Anyway, the Americans really do want to create this Golden Dome idea, which is like what Reagan, Star Wars, was trying to do back in the 80s. I was living in Toronto in the 80s, and I wound up in New York for almost 20 years and then Europe. So the Golden Dome really requires extension over us, over Canada, because they expect the Pentagon, their wargaming, they expect a Russian attack to come over the North Pole. Frankly, more likely through Alaska and then down into Alberta, Saskatchewan, that type of thing. So it's really about defense more than anything, and offense, because as you know, they've renamed the DoD to Department of War. So that should tell you something. That's what I call a weak signal. And few people know that that department was called Department of War right after the Civil War. And it wasn't until I think it was Truman that renamed it to DoD after World War II. So Department of War is their historical stance. And Canada is very vital because we have a shared border. We have tons of resources up here. And people shouldn't get too pessimistic about, what's going to happen to Canada, because we have so much by way of resources and wealth and capability. Some of it has been squandered, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years, because I think a North American Union could easily happen that extends all the way up to maybe Greenland, which, by the way, Greenland is part of North America. It's not Europe. It happens to be governed by Denmark, but it's really a North American geographical thing, all the way down into the southern cone of Latin America. So that whole strip, that vertical strip, geography, one day, I believe, will be some form of union. The USA, by the way, may not exist at one point. They may split up, have secession problems, and then reassemble a new continental or even maybe transcontinental construct. Yeah, it really is. In summary, what this is, the four turnings are basically the high, which, think about the 1950s after World War II, the high, which I was born into the mid part of the 50s, so that's how old I am. Anyway, the awakening came after that, which, think about the hippies and revolt, rebellion in the 60s. 70s was the unraveling into the 80s. And then we're now into the crisis phase. That's the fourth turning, which is crisis of values, money, politics, geopolitics. All of that is characteristic of the crisis. And by the way, that happened during the Civil War. There was a crisis era back then. And then, as we know, 1930s and 40s was World War II. So we're back in a new war cycle as described. So it's basically a total of 80 years divided into chunks of 20. 80 years is one life, human life. 20, 20, 20, 20. That's what the four turnings are. The good news is the first turning, which should arrive in the 2030s, probably after 2032, will be a glorious renaissance, probably underpinned by AI, the good part of AI, I should say. Probably new values, new system. Maybe people won't even have to work. And that first turning, there's going to be a complete renaissance. And by the way, that can include arts, music, everything. And people won't have this tremendous burden on them that we have in this current society. Martin Armstrong, yeah. Armstrong, actually, he'd be better as a Brian, but just kidding. Yeah, Armstrong economics is good. I do listen to Jim Willey, who's the Golden Jackass guy. I don't necessarily buy into everything he says, but he has some good stuff. I'm very eclectic. So, when I'm doing wargaming for companies, I always pull out and bring this book, which is Sun Tzu's Art of War. I always mention to people, to this very day, the Army War College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, this is required reading. And in fact, they have a whole course or a series of courses on the Sun Tzu battle philosophy. So that's another book that I'm very, very big on. I don't really go into conspiracy stuff. I've been accused of that, by the way, but I really like to think of myself as a factist as well as a theorist. And I pull information. One of the things I like to read, which a lot of people hate, is the Financial Times of London. And I always say to people, the FT, you have to know how to read it. So they're a City of London communications mouthpiece. And when you put that lens on it, it kind of tells you what they're trying to tell you. But I get a lot of very valuable information out of that. I buy the FT pretty much every weekend and sometimes during the week, depending on world events. What else? Oh, I like the Wolf Report. Do you read the Wolf Report? Yeah, he's got some good stuff, especially lately. He's really diving into the credit cycle problems that we're seeing. If you're on CNBC today, you'll see everybody talking about First Brands and Jeffries and the private credit blowup. And the funny thing about that is people are saying private credit, well, wait a minute, that's confined to this little corner of the financial system. And they don't realize all these, like Jeffries, Ares Management, that type of thing, they get their liquidity from the big banks. So if they sneeze, the big banks can catch cold too, because they've given them lines of credit to help them loan money to these crazy subprime auto companies like Tricolor, which I posted. I was one of the first, I'm not bragging, but I tend to be early. I posted about Tricolor weeks ago, just as it was breaking. And the funny thing about them, Tricolor was making subprime loans to migrants, some of the uninvited guests that came in, and they were double pledging, allegedly, the assets being the vehicles. And the crazy thing is that a lot of the borrowers, when they were uninvited and asked to leave, they just drove their vehicle across the border to Mexico, and it's theirs to sell, take apart for parts, whatever they want. So Tricolor is an unusual situation. It's Chapter 7 liquidation with no assets. Their assets are gone. They drove away. So these credit issues we're seeing now are symptomatic of what I think will be a pretty big credit, I don't know if I call it a meltdown, credit event. It's happening right now. Yes. Yeah, they do. They do. You know, when I was in marketing at Kraft in the 80s, we always had to drag out that 5-year plan. We had another one. It was in the coffee division, and we had something called the Folgers Defense Plan. If Folgers Coffee ever stormed into Canada, and that was when Procter and Gamble owned it, and that was always something that got dusted off. And the war room was set up, ready to go. They never did come in, by the way, but it was good to be prepared for that. But my view is 3-year plans, which I would call more compass, horizon plans, which are broad strokes. So like, here's our, rough idea of where we want to be in 3 years. And that can be updated annually and then clarified and tightened up as time goes on. But a 5-year plan is a real waste of time. I don't know any company that does 5-year plans, but in the 80s and even up to mid 90s, people did it. It just gave them the security of being able to map out their future in concrete terms. But yeah, 3-year, frankly, now I don't even know many people doing 3-year plans. But I like the idea of compass, which, by the way, Bain, it's a lot of what Bain does is they help companies, including a couple of clients I've worked with on Wargaming and thinking, map out a compass document that's basically right to win areas that might be up for grabs. Like, let's say if we're talking about cosmetics, like L'Oreal and LVMH are two very fierce competitors. So if you're Estee Lauder, you say, well, my right to win area is in skincare. Then as far as fragrance, that there's opportunistic areas that I can go for. As far as color and eye care, eye makeup, L'Oreal owns that and always will own that. So you're wasting your resources if you decide to do a direct attack against L'Oreal and eye care or eye makeup. And that's kind of how to think about your strategic options. Yeah, back in the dot bomb era, when I left MetLife, by the way, I had a big job at MetLife for that IPO. After the IPO was done, I just decided corporate life was kind of a finished chapter for me. So I went into what I call a dot bomb. It was actually a really good idea. It was called WorkLinks. And it was out of the box hosted intranet for companies. So they didn't have to build their own intranet. They could just buy this solution, turn on certain channels, personalize it using software called Vignette, which I don't know if it even exists. But that era, basically, we had to pitch to investors. And also, ultimately, I became part of investment committees at Assembler and other entities that wanted a point of view from people that work in the industry. So we've vetted a number of food and beverage deals as well as beauty, cosmetic deals. And we pretty much know the space. Space has changed a lot since I worked in the 80s for food, for example, but I pretty much know what's on trend, what's not. By the way, analysis is very, very important. Like by the way, trends exist in the markets as well. So you'll see a trend to the Mag 7 And you either get on board with that or you don't. And frankly, that's where most of the gains in the markets have been, is in the Mag 7. And that's a whole other story of how that happened. But particularly in areas like apparel, beauty, food, beverage, the trends are really, really key. And that gives confidence to somebody investing, like a private equity firm, to say, yeah, this one's very much on trend. You know those masks they have now with the lights in them? Those Omnilux and whatever? That's a trend, because people are more and more afraid of, very radical surgeries. And if they can do something every day that helps their skin look good and, massage, whatever, that's a trend that people are buying into. Could be. I was part of a very big effort, residential program that we actually ran up here in Toronto for them. And I can't really talk, I'm not under NDA, but just out of respect for them. So I really like the company. I think the company is a phenomenal company. There were a couple of things that were not anticipated, namely the pandemic and the closing down of China and travel retail. So that was a major speed bump for them. But give them credit; they've rebounded. They cut their losses, they regrouped, they're carrying on. And it's a very well managed company. I come across very few companies that are so well managed as Estee Lauder. And by the way, their talent is phenomenal. They incubate talent for other businesses. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Charlotte Tilbury. She was a beauty artist advisor with Estee Lauder. And she created her own empire. So it's kind of like a finishing school for beauty and cosmetics. Ever since their founder, Estee, they've just carried on the tradition forever. And yeah, we really like them. Leadership, by the way, they have a very tight, this is public information, by the way. They have a very tight relationship with the Wharton School, which in my humble opinion is the top business school in North America. The Wharton School, and I have a business partner, Florida, who's a Wharton graduate. And, everybody talks about Harvard. Stanford for tech is still way up there. But as far as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the Wharton School just runs circles around them, because it's their discipline around finance, around strategy, that type of thing. And the Estee Lauder Companies has funded several, kind of, what would you call them? Not scholarships, but schools within Wharton for leadership and development and that type of thing. So absolutely leadership's number one. Then brands, you were wanting to talk about brands today. Some of the brands that they have, including the mother brand, are very powerful. They evoke a lot of loyalty imagery. They're authentic. Like, you just don't hear of Estee Lauder having a scandal like Nestle. If I may say, I don't work for Nestle. Nestle tends to get itself into all kinds of crazy situations, whereas the former, they don't. They're ethical. The products, by the way, are very high quality. I don't think I've ever seen a recall of their products, because they're just done right the first time. Does that answer your question? Yeah. We can also talk about one that went off the rails that I worked for. So, I don't want to cast aspersions on them, but if you look at what Warren Buffett said recently about his Kraft Heinz investment, he describes that as his one biggest regret in his entire career. He even mentioned it in an interview recently. And it's sad, because in its heyday, Kraft was the Procter & Gamble of food. And even Heinz, condiments are things you put on your food. They were really admired all through the 20th century, but somehow that company, possibly through its private equity hit, because 3G out of Brazil got hold of Kraft and pretty much ripped the guts out of it. They decided to monetize everything. They eventually had to take a major goodwill hit, because they just stopped all the support for the brands and innovation, that type of thing. It became a financial Excel spreadsheet exercise, that whole era, which went from, I think, I want to say 2010 to 2020-ish. So sadly, Kraft Heinz is regrouping. All you have to do is look at their stock price. And I don't think Michael Burry's buying KHC right now. Yeah. So I started off as an assistant in the beverages division when it was then General Foods, and then Kraft was merged into it by Philip Morris in the late 80s. And I wound up running the post cereals division and the beverage division. And then I wound up in a strategy job working on NAFTA. And then I was transferred to New York to help the total North American company build a learning academy, a marketing academy. So basically a marketing excellence academy. We won awards for it, by the way, because we basically used competencies and mapped all the learning and all the tools, everything into kind of a learning capable and then intermediate and advanced stratification of marketing capabilities. So that's what I did in my last chapter at Kraft, and it worked out really well. In those days, in the early 90s, Kraft was pretty much unbeatable. Pretty much unbeatable. And then, of course, they split the company back in 2010. In fact, I was at the Ascot race course at a conference in London when they announced the new name of the split, the spinoff, which was Mondelez. And I have a funny story that I can't repeat here because it's not for most audiences. But anyway, when they spun off the snacks part of Kraft Global, that was kind of the start of the problems, if you can say that. Oh, for sure, they lost the DNA of the company. Like if you, I encourage people, by the way, who are interested in food, watch the History Channel, the food brands that built America. And they have everything there from Hershey, which is not part of Kraft, by the way. Kraft itself, the cheese business. And Kraft, by the way, was started by a Canadian. A lot of people don't know that. J.L. Kraft was a Canadian who couldn't get financing for his business here. And he went to the US, to Chicago, and the rest is history. But that series on History Channel is just brilliant. It goes through pretty much every food brand in the Americas and describes how they started, challenges they had. For instance, the Depression. People couldn't afford real mayonnaise. They came up with something called Miracle Whip, which was affordable. It had less of the expensive ingredients, but it was, a decent spread for making sandwiches. So that series is just wonderful. And that's what I think what happened with Kraft is they forgot where they came from. It's like, who was that? I just watched that Victoria Beckham documentary, and Mel B said to Victoria Beckham, never forget where you came from, which made her very angry. Yes, Spice Girls, yeah. Never forget where you came from. But that applies to corporations as well. Like, don't forget your roots. So that was for sure one. And then the second thing was, I think execution became an issue, sadly. Not just them, but a number of companies. I don't know if you heard this week about Nestle. Nestle was always the 800-pound gorilla in the food space. I wargamed against them, I'd say, in about 20 countries, mainly in coffee, because coffee is their biggest profit pool company. A lot of people don't know that, but coffee is the lifeblood of that company. They've gone through, I think, 3 CEOs in less than a year, mainly because of inappropriate workplace behavior. And a lot of their engines are sputtering. They finally just had a decent print a few days ago, but that company should be 3 or 4 times bigger than it is right now. And of course, the 39% tariffs did not help either. Even though they are diversified operationally, it still was kind of another issue for them to deal with. So it happens to all companies. Everybody has their little speed bump, their challenges. They have to just dig themselves out of the hole and dust themselves off and fight another day. Well, that gets back to the trend, David, trend analysis, because, by the way, beans are good protein. Beans should be very on trend. Beans, they play a real role even in a modern diet, but a lot of companies don't know how to contemporize, if I could use that word, contemporize their brands. So maybe get them out of tins into squeezable microwave packs or single serves, that type of thing. And contemporization is very important in food because tastes broadly, for instance, if you go to Mexico, people like spicy food, but will they not ever eat tandoori chicken? No, because they like chicken. It's a chicken culture, and actually tandoori spices kind of suit their palate. So, yeah, it's a constant kind of quest to find the intersection of trends and your portfolio. And if there are gaps, you close those gaps. Like Estee Lauder, by the way, is really good at that. They do a white space, X and Y axis, and then they populate all their brands. I think they have 28 of them. And then they keep adjusting as trends change and consumers change. White space will open up, say, in very high value skincare. And that's why they acquired La Mer back in the 90s to go up against La Prairie, which is a Beiersdorf brand. So yeah, that white space mapping is a very, very useful tool. It just visualizes where your portfolio is here and how you might want to look at adjacencies and closing white gaps up in a higher value tier. That's one of them. We have a whole toolkit. So we have something called a trend canvas, which is just basically a template, but we show very vivid examples of how to use it. And the trend canvas, which I think came from a company called, not Trend Hunter, but another trend company, and they gave me permission to use it. It gives you a way of mapping a visual. For instance, that trend with men with the man buns and all that, hairstyles and such, that spawned a lot of innovation around pop-ups, pop-up salons and so on. Like the other thing is, here's a brand that I use and I really like. It's Everyman Jack for beards. I don't know if you use that one. But when people started growing beards like you and I have, all kinds of issues came out. Like, how do you moisturize? How do you groom a beard? I even have one that does a extra moisturizer of the beard that I like. So trends, one day, by the way, we'll be shaving again. So that'll all go away. But the trend piece is very important. So that tool. And then we do question theory. So you send me a very good list of powerful questions. We have a whole module that we do on the art and architecture of powerful questions. And it was so effective. We've had companies turn it into a whole training or learning like day, just how to ask the right question. Because in strategy, if you ask the wrong question, you're going to go down a garden path to a very bad solution. So there's always pressure to go to solution right away. The best thing to spend time on is crafting question, making sure you've got powerful question words like why. Why is a much more powerful question than when. When is just looking at your why. Okay, yeah, we'll do that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Why opens up scope around a whole trajectory, a whole line of exploration. So we have a lot of the Japanese, by the way, are famous for the 5 whys. The 5 whys is you don't get to the real question until you ask why 5 times. Yeah, the Japanese are really, really good at that. And so we have tools like that. We have the scenario planning, as you know, which comes from a book called Art of the Long View. Harry de Goos back in the 80s. It was Roald Dutch Shell trying to figure out whether the Soviet Union would stay together or not. And they made a big bet on North Sea oil. They bet that the Soviet Union would break up in the early 90s, which it did. And they went forward on, I think in those days, it was a 10 billion North Sea drilling project. So that long view approach and the steps of scenario planning, we've baked into what we do. And then usually in a 2-day format, we go to the second day, which is like the first day is about, it's like a funnel. So it's a wide funnel, and then we keep narrowing. By the end of the first day, we're ready to talk about activation in day 2. And activation will be, by the way, we do role playing, get into the competitor's headset. How would they think about this? What would they do to defend or counterattack? And by the end of the second day, we come up with a blueprint, actually a set of tactical plans that can be refined after the workshop. And then people go off and get approvals up the line and then deliver the plan. So yeah, there you go. So this comes from, by the way, I've studied with Global Business Network back in the, when was that? Early 90s when I was in New York. I'd go up to Boston. They no longer, I think they were acquired by either Deloitte or one of the big consulting firms. Global Business Network teamed up with the Rockefeller Foundation. And this graphic here came from their 2010 it's a GBN Rockefeller Foundation joint futurism report. And what they said would happen is there would be events that would happen in kind of a succession that would redefine society globally and actually create something called the Great Reset. They actually coined that term, not WEF. WEF took it to another level of abstraction, but basically, just working from the upper left, lockstep is about everybody, I guess you'd call it the surveillance society that we're seeing now. So basically having a surveillance kind of infrastructure put around society. Then Clever Together was basically taking down boundaries and nation state kind of, what would you call it? Separate nation states and combining the world into basically 4 or 5 regional blocks. And then Smart Scramble here is interesting. It's about smart technology, AI, that type of thing. They really saw all that coming. And the Smart Scramble, by the way, is the AI race between the East and the West. Hack Attack is something that we've seen hacking happen, but what they foresaw was a global hacking incident, that it could be from a bad actor in one of the not so nice enemy states, which people can name them, that will cause people to really rethink where they keep their money, whether it's in banks, whether it's in stock market, that type of thing. So the way they put these scenarios together was extremely sophisticated. It took them months I've got the report still in my file, but it was very, very well put together. Yes. Yeah. So it's a good question, David. So with scenario planning, what's most important is not to take a crystal ball and forecast one future. It's to be prepared for maybe one of 3 futures. I'll say like one, the most likely one, the least likely, and then one in between. So when we do this work, it's always being ready for a range of futures. And you can put probabilities against them, but it's important to have real hard data to do that. For instance, when I was in Monaco a year and a half ago, people were talking about, well, what's going to happen? Is China going to win the AI war or the West? And Nina Schick was there. Nina Schick is one of the world's leading AI experts. And she comes from Nepal. She's done a lot of work in Asia, but she's also worked with 10 Downing Street, the White House. She worked for the Biden administration. And she would tell you that the race will be won with whoever has the best compute, the best full stack of AI. And a lot of that, she believed, and I believe too, boils down to energy. So energy is, just as I mentioned that Shell earlier, Ready to Goose, the oil thing. Energy is probably the biggest determinant of success or failure as it relates to these races. So as it happens right now, China is well ahead of the US in terms of energy generation, believe it or not. And they're even building another Three Gorges Dam, basically, right now, that could double their energy capacity. Whereas the US is building these data warehouses for AI that depend on things like a mini reactor to power it. And basically, the US is running up against a ceiling as it relates to energy available for compute power, which, as you know, takes tremendous amounts of energy to do the compute aspect of AI. So, energy, I think, and by the way, that's why Russia has survived to this point, and some would say even thrived, because they have so much energy. And Europe has nothing. Europe is totally dependent on others, the kindness of others for its energy. Yeah. It's a storage of work and energy. I guess you could say it's, work is energy in a way. So, yeah, it's a good way to put it. Yeah. It's very sad what's going on in Europe, because my mother was European, by the way. She was born in Ireland, raised in London, England. And I was just in Europe last summer to 3 different countries, and the one that I think will emerge probably best is Spain, where I lived for 5 years. Spain has a way of surprising and surviving things, whereas the rest of the EU is very much oriented to regulation. So they say that America excels at innovation, China at replication, and Europe at regulation. And yeah, and unfortunately, Germany, by the way, Germany was once a very innovative economy. And unfortunately, after the regime that ended about 10 years ago, they just became, I don't know, distracted or something, closing all their nuclear plants and deciding they were going to go full alternative. Now they're reopening coal plants, go figure. Whereas France has made nuclear energy work for decades without even a single incident like Chernobyl. In that sense, France is better positioned, but Europe as a whole really needs to figure things out and maybe use Spain as their model. Yeah, I think the problem is The ones that do this best are the ones that had an empire. So maybe the Portuguese would be an exception to that. But if you look at the British Empire, where the sun never set, I mean, Britain really had a global mindset even before the Victorian era. And then they took it to a new level with the Industrial Revolution. And then France, even though I don't like what they did in Africa, they just got kicked out of Africa last year. France had a kind of an empire mindset, Napoleonic and so on. And then Spain had a very big and for a while successful empire reaching into Latin America, Central America, type of thing. And then unfortunately, they went bankrupt fighting wars that they couldn't win. So I think having an empire kind of history or DNA that helps countries, helps nations think beyond their own borders. And that's one of the issues Europe has, is it's got to really start thinking beyond its own borders. One exception, ASML in the Netherlands, which is photographic chips. That's an example of an excellent world-class chip maker, but you don't get many more beyond that in Europe. Defense, maybe a Dassault System, which, by the way, I've worked with them in France, aviation and defense company. They're world class. But aside from Spotify and a couple others, continental Europe has really been struggling to innovate. Yeah, so we never do this work. This business wargaming is never done the same way twice. So I worked with a very large City of London bank. We did a digital futures wargaming in actually an amazing hotel in the City of London, the Four Seasons Trinity Square, which is the old Port Authority of London. Actually was featured in Skyfall, the James Bond movie. So we did a whole theme around that. And that version, we had tables set up in rounds, and tables had different focal points. So food and water, retail, e-commerce, wealth management, and communications and banking and so on. What do you think was the most powerful table that basically buried everybody else? No, it was communications. And that's one of the biggest learnings that I've had out of this work is communications is incredibly powerful. So you've heard of asymmetric warfare. That's what's going on right now. So asymmetric warfare is information wars. So, for example, how many people does China have? Population. Yeah, they communicate 1.4 billion, but a family member who lived there for 30 years and got out before 2020, his wife and kids, he would tell you something different. But the more they communicate that they're huge, and by the way, bigger than India, which they're not, that's a proven fact. It gives this aura of invincibility and scale and size, which scares off people. Actually, there's another book here. I want overwhelmed with books. This one, Harry Dent, The Demographic Cliff. This is another really good book. This guy, by the way, is often described as a perma-bear. He has his own channel. I think it's called Dent Research, maybe. Anyway, he makes a really good point that forever in history, cycles of economic growth and depression center around life cycles. And for example, he said from 2005 to 2008, he wrote this book in the 90s, by the way. He said that boomers would surpass peak spending years, and peak spending years are basically your mid 40s. And I know that applied for me. I spent ridiculous money in New York in the mid 40s. And then since then, how many wardrobes do you need? How many cars do you need? How many homes? That type of thing. That fall off basically creates an economic recession climate. And only now are millennials starting to take up some of that slack. The oldest millennial now is actually 45, right? The millennial cohort started in 1980. So we're now in this second peak demographically where the millennials are really holding up this economy and the 1%, but we won't talk about them. But yeah, the millennials spending, once that tails off, which is kind of happening now, we could see another downturn until the Gen Zs pick up the baton. So this idea of cycles is both, it's not only the fourth turning, and there are cycles within cycles. So this is kind of, he calls it saeculum, the 80-year grand scheme. And then you get into cycles within the cycle, which is this. So it's important to understand all levels of classic cycles that happen in human history and then plan around that. Yes, correct. So the real dangerous period, by the way, is coming up. 2027, 2020, 2032 is what Neil Howe would say is the blow off, the final cataclysmic event, which a lot of people like Martin Armstrong say that'll be World War, the final confrontation with China. And then whoever wins that will reset the game, and it'll be a glorious first turning after that. So that's why there's so much energy and thought and communication being put into what's going on now, east, west. By the way, China had this narrative of the Belt and Road. That's been blown up. Like the Ukraine war, bifurcated. Their think belt is the land. It's either belt or road is the land. Rails. They built rail systems that went all the way through to West Germany and London. That's been completely broken. So Italy, for example, Italy kicked them out of their ports. The prior regime in Italy had made a deal with China. We'll give you unfettered access to 5 key ports, everything from Genoa all the way around to the other side. Giorgia Meloni came in and just ripped up the deal. So when you think and hear, wow, there's going to be this global Marco Polo 2.0, it's not really happening. In fact, actually, I think the real road is being built up in the Arctic. Because in the Arctic, you have the most efficient highway from the west into the east. And by the way, with the ice melt and everything, it's opening up. The Northwest Passage is opening. Watch that area for Belt and Road. Oh, yeah. 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 Startups, I would say, have much more to lose. So it's one thing to be a Nestle or General Motors. Like General Motors is a whole other story of what's going on over there right now. But let's say Tesla. Tesla's a good example. So that was a startup, very high risk, even with the Musk brain and so on. A lot of people said it would fall flat on its face, and it didn't. At least to this point, it hasn't. Smaller startups, like I know you've done some work with fitness apps and that type of thing. You have to make sure that your cost of failure is manageable. So if it's a piece of software or it's IP, that you just make sure nobody can duplicate that IP. Otherwise, they'll do it cheaper than you and shut you down. So yeah, the risks I would say are different for a startup because let's say, look at Microsoft versus, I don't know, what's a good example? What would you say is a good tech startup that tried to take on Microsoft? Zoom. So Microsoft has Teams, and they would tell you, oh, Teams is way better. It integrates into the Microsoft 365. It's, and to some extent that's true. Frankly, I loved Zoom when it first came out during COVID. I just thought it was phenomenal. They thought through all the functionality. I don't use it as much now, and look at you here on Riverside. And I think that's maybe where Zoom didn't think through their whole ecosystem. They should have been planning for podcasters. And I don't even know if they have such a platform. Yeah, startups, they have different risks. But, you have to have some efforts blow up in order to weed out. It's like the late 1990s, Pets.com and all that. That whole era, which I lived through when I was working on Wall Street, it felt like it was a bubble. The NASDAQ was a bubble. And one of the few that survived was one everybody said wouldn't survive, which was Amazon. And Jeff Bezos had a lot of help. It helped that I think it was his father or grandfather was in DARPA. He worked for D.E. Shaw. He had a Wall Street background. He had a lot of help to make sure he survived. But look at Amazon today compared to what was just a book company in the 90s. So you have to have a grand vision. You have to have an excellent strategy. You have to have competencies, talent, and be able to build it out in a way that no one else can. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, so for example, for what we do at Wargaming, the thing that AI is incredibly valuable for one particular thing. Because we do competitive intelligence briefs before we even do the workshop. Historically, that has taken weeks or even months to put together. So it's researching the competitor, its lines of business, financials, dissecting annual reports, all of that into a tightly summarized, synthesized document. Well, AI can do that in a couple of hours maximum. So AI can be, incredibly useful. Now, as far as AI deciding a battle, plan? Probably not, because there's so many judgment elements to go into that. And also, AI is very bad at creativity. So if you ask AI to make a painting, or write a poem, or write a song, it's on TikTok how funny it is. Well, it's kind of scary, actually. But you need this. That's why I'm big on this HI plus AI. I did a speech on that some years ago. It's on YouTube. The idea is to take the best components of what AI can do, which is pattern recognition, information, organizing, basic content, and then pairing that with an HI and a copilot construct. And the human intelligence can be better deployed more efficiently for creative thinking, discernment, that type of thing. And then together, you've got synergy around the whole thing. And by the way, a friend of mine is a captain for Lufthansa in Germany. And the CEO said, when AI first became a thing, he said, we're going to have passenger planes without pilots. And he was in the meeting with them and he said, really? So how would that work when you're going through the intertropical convergence zone where that Air France plane went down? When your pitot tube sensors are all frozen and all the information you're getting is wrong and you have to do something, you think AI is going to sort all that out? And the CEO dropped that idea. So it's kind of a corporate mindset where humans are an expense item versus humans working with autopilot and all that can actually have a better outcome, which is true. In aviation, it's absolutely true. Humans problem solving is not perfect, but paired with AI, it's much better than without. We've worked with Deloitte, by the way, and I like Deloitte. We worked with them in Chicago many years ago, and actually I've done work with them recently for their dashboard for private equity deals. And Deloitte's a good firm, but again, that's frankly, its leadership was to blame for that. They should have been overseeing and making sure that, that report, while assisted by AI, would be ultimately produced by humans. So yeah, that was a big boo-boo. Like, think of Arthur Andersen and Enron. Enron literally decimated Arthur Andersen. Both of those companies, by the way, have come back. I discovered. I actually tagged both of them in a post. It's like everybody thinks Lehman Brothers is done. Lehman Brothers still exists in the Cayman Islands. Lehman Brothers still has cash in the Cayman Islands. So, yeah, that book was very popular 15 years ago. Actually, when I moved back from Europe in 2012, that was the thing, and I haven't heard of it recently. I guess the idea, I always think of that in metaphor terms. So we have a variety of metaphors like the fat and happy whale that's floating around like a Procter and Gamble or some Nestle would be another company. And then a school of sharks comes along and nibbles, using the same ocean analogy, nibbles away at the belly of the whale and maybe doesn't kill it right away, but over time, the whale just turns turtle and dies. So blue ocean, in my view, I would describe that as, there is a world of opportunity, but quite honestly, a lot of the white spaces are already taken. Excuse me. There's just a lot less prosperity right now at the end of this cycle, and you have to be very, very discerning. And I think discernment's super important right now. Discerning information, what's true, what's false, and where there's an opportunity, a little profit pool that you could tap into. And that's the kind of thing a lot of people don't do. They just think, well, they'll build it and consumers will come. Well, if you build something of appeal to the lower end, lower middle consumer, they're tapped out. They don't have money. They're buy now, pay later people. That's where a lot of innovation that you're seeing now. I mentioned those masks earlier. That's for people with money, people that still have disposable income. And sadly, a lot of society is, frankly, in Southeast Asia, where I've done a lot of work, they live on $2 a day, $2 US a day. That funds everything, the food, caring for the family, the whole thing. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that in the world right now until we get through to a first turning. So I think it's still useful to think that way, but the world is not one big ocean with unlimited opportunity. It's now fragmented and pixelated into many smaller opportunities. Yeah, they're run by a former Kraft guy, by the way, who I know. He was in one of my Wargamings. And Chris Kaczynski. They've been dabbling with all these Happy Meal combos. The Big Mac is the smaller Mac and all that stuff. That's a real tell, by the way. a leading indicator of how stressed the consumer is. There's a McDonald's right around the corner from here, and when you see how much money people have to spend to get a basic Happy Meal, it's sad. That's why a lot of people are cooking at home again now, which, by the way, is an opportunity for my alma mater, Kraft. They should really be full bore in the meal kits and such, because there are people cooking at home now. Well, the big one I'm posting about these days is I think the auto sector as a whole is the new 2008 subprime. So General Motors just took a $1.6 billion charge. They've got more charges coming. By the way, a lot of people think Tesla is just a complete bubble, even though Tesla is more than autos, space, ventures, tunneling, boring company, that type of thing. So in a way, he has a portfolio of assets that he can juggle. But autos, let's face it, how many people can afford a $60,000 Jeep Cherokee Limited? It's their addressable market is shrinking more and more. And even if you lease a vehicle, it's you got leasing, insurance, parking. Toronto, driving around Toronto, and the speed cams. That all those expenses really add up to take a big chunk of disposable income away from people. And that's why I think Uber has done so well. And Uber is a really good product. I think I've only had one not so great Uber experience over 10 plus years, and they fixed it. And that's frankly, why do you need to own a vehicle unless you live out in the country, unless you have daily commutes from, say, the suburbs to downtown? Then you have a reason why. But autos, I think over time, mobility is going to change so markedly, people will not believe it. Well, robotaxis are interesting because, Uber was early into that and still is. I think have they launched their taxi again? What happened is Uber launched the driverless taxi in San Francisco back, I want to say 10 years ago. And I actually did a module speaking about it in Berlin. The thing they told then what was kind of a crude version of AI, they basically told it to stay within the white lines. And it did, in most part, but any guess as to what happened? It made it go back to the drawing board. So like in Toronto, we have bike lanes. So the white lines, there's one outer white line, which includes the little narrow bike lane. And then there's the dotted lines for lane change and that type of thing. And in San Francisco, they didn't have barriers between the bike lanes and the auto lanes. So the car was migrating over and wiping out cyclists while staying within the solid white lines. So they had to retool that AI so it could be much more specific and much more directed. I think actually, Uber taxi, I've seen a lot of prototypes for the airborne Uber Air Taxi. I think that will happen. That would be interesting because I like helicopters. So imagine having your own little helicopter at your command day in and day out. You need a lot of governance around that, but it's an interesting idea. It's like the Jetsons. Right. Well, this wargaming I did in Monaco, and it was, by the way, people come to this Monaco Fun Forum are very high net worth family offices, the likes also of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, but also smaller players out of Luxembourg. And by the way, you think all these sophisticated people that live in basically palaces in Europe know what's going to happen. They don't. They don't think beyond what's right in front of them. So when I did this for Brexit in Berlin, people said Brexit's never going to happen. It cannot happen. Brexit in that era, what was that, 2016 or so? If Brexit were to happen, that's the end of Britain. So it took a few years, but now we're seeing some scary stuff happening with the UK. So basically, these asset allocators, leaders, allocators are basically people that take a position and say, okay, we're going to allocate this amount into AI, this amount into other tech, this amount into gold and silver, this amount into financial, whatever, services. And they have to figure out what does the future look like? so that they can be ready for that future and actually, frankly, front run everybody else, invest in the key sectors. What was one of the big sectors back in 5, 6, 7 years ago was TIA, which is Total Information Awareness. And TIA came out of, by the way, after 2001, all the agencies said, look, we got to start talking to each other, sharing intelligence, information, threats, whatever. That's where total information awareness took off. And then a company was born. Can you guess which company came out of TIA? Yeah. So I was talking about Palantir. I forget which city it was in Europe. And people were looking at me very quizzically. Like, wait a minute, you mean there's a company that's going to profit from all of this and sell information to governments? And I said, yeah, it's called Palantir. At that time, by the way, it was $7 a share. And Peter Thiel was still involved with it. But then I don't know what it's trading at now. I think a couple hundred maybe, or 100 and something. The people that read the signals, weak signals, I call it, would have been in that name early on. NVIDIA was another one. When I was in New York in 2007, I remember this video gaming chip company that was called NVIDIA. A friend of mine told me about it from JP Morgan. And I could have invested in that, and I didn't. Kick myself on that one. That's one of the mistakes I made. But look at what happened to NVIDIA. It just went into the stratosphere. So a lot of these people, these asset management people, are looking for the next NVIDIA, the next Palantir, the next Tesla. And basically what my work with them is about helping them to decide how to think about trends. So how to think about, working from home even. Is that a permanent trend or is that just a kind of a temporary thing? And once you take a position on that, the work from home is not going to ever go away completely. Then you make your investments in the likes of Zoom or Teams or whatever. As it happens now, people are going back to the office. So, it's important to think through all this. Like, what would be the triggers? Well, the trigger is corporations are sitting on all this high-priced real estate, and they have to do something with it. And also, there is value to face-to-face interaction. There's a lot of value to just, grabbing a coffee with your coworker and kicking around an idea and doing it kind of informally versus in this kind of venue. There's value to people at least a couple days a week working together. And then Mondays and Fridays, if you want to work from home and do your admin, whatever, that's fine too. So I think the future that emerged is a hybrid structure of working. Yeah, so fierce activation is the notion of rather than do things incrementally and being kind of wussy about it, like, oh, I'll give you an example. McDonald's, which you brought up earlier, came up with a concept called McCafe back in 2007-8. They decided they were sick and tired of Starbucks robbing breakfast and robbing coffee from them. So what they did is they came storming out in a very big way. It was a direct attack, by the way. And direct attacks are the riskiest unless you're as big as McDonald's. So they actually carved out a little part of the McDonald's and created this cafe-like atmosphere, this ambiance like a Starbucks. And they basically undercut the price of the coffee just to the point where the economy was turning down. So their fierce activation recognized a GFC recession. People were becoming price conscious, but you could deliver a similar experience to Starbucks with breakfast items like McMuffins, that type of thing that we're familiar. And they wrapped all that into a big, basically global rollout. And they did it all within weeks and caught Starbucks. Starbucks was blindsided by that. In medieval metaphor terms, we call that when somebody has a walled city, like Starbucks had a walled city with all their little shops, their offerings, the barista experience, the whole thing. How do you win the peasants from a walled city? Any thoughts? How do you take those people out of the walled city and bring them over to your side? Well, you could either dig under the wall and grab them and offer them something on the spot that's better. Or what about creating a new walled city on another hilltop? And that's what McCafe did. And they attracted back a big cohort of Starbucks audience, probably the lower third, said, hey, I don't want to pay $6, $7 for a latte. I'm going over there. And by the way, I'm getting my Egg McMuffin, which I like. So that's fierce activation where you just have this. By the way, Apple, I think, does that quite well too. I was just reading Apple's coming out with a MacBook Pro with a touch screen, which, by the way, Steve Jobs hated that. He said, never, never, as long as I'm alive, there must never be a MacBook Pro with a touch screen. They're coming out next year with that. Yeah, that's my one. I have a MacBook Pro I bought 15 years ago that, believe it or not, still works. My one complaint is it doesn't have a touch screen. And so now I'm going to buy MacBook Pro touchscreen next year for sure. With Apple? So with Apple, what they did, like when they, by the way, I think their rollout of the new iPhone, and but the one thing that stood out from that presentation was the translator earbuds. That was very innovative, very useful, very appealing. The rest of it to me was kind of a non-event, but normally when Apple does that day, that announcement, they're ready to go. Every single Apple store is ready with all their point of sale material, with all the training for the Magic Bar, whatever I think it's called the Magic Bar. All that is all ready to go, and they just blast it out before Samsung can even think about it. So in a global tech world, you have to be ready to just do things on that kind of scale and not incrementally. Most companies, when they roll out an innovation globally, they'll say, okay, we're going to do US first, then Canada, then continental Europe, then Asia is usually left to the last. Well, that's not a way to win. You have to basically blast it out to everybody before somebody can imitate you and do it cheaper, better, faster. So there's the direct attack, indirect attack, a bypass attack, a guerrilla. Anyway, the ones that are least used are the bypass attack. So basically, a bypass attack is, well, let's stick with the Apple example. So Apple Music, and by the way, I still have 2 of my iPods from the 90s that I just hold on to. They still work. I keep them. Apple, the whole iTunes thing, they kind of abandoned that too quickly. So what they basically said is, like 2007, with the launch of the iPhone, 2006, 7, we have a choice. Either scale up bigger and better in music or go after mobile telephony. And they elected to put all their focus and resources into the iPhone, which, by the way, has a lot of iTunes features in it. Meanwhile, who came along to displace them? Streaming music. So Spotify thought, okay, we could try to do this in a handheld thing. They could have partnered with Nokia. We've done Nokia as a former client, by the way. Spotify could have teamed up with Nokia to do a version of a smartphone with music. They decided to just bypass the whole handheld phone thing and do their own Spotify platform. And we're very, very successful. A bypass is basically saying, look, we don't want to play in that stream with that device, with that architecture, whatever that platform. We're going to develop our own thing. And then they forced Apple to really rethink their whole music strategy. And so little Spotify, you were asking about startups. Spotify is an amazing success story. They took on Goliath, and I don't know how they're doing right now, but last I looked, they were doing pretty well. So a bypass attack, by the way, it needs a lot of courage, needs a lot of brain power to think through how to create a separate avenue that your Goliath isn't thinking about. Excuse me. Yeah, it is. Yeah. You think of other, Elon with Tesla, there's a lot of bypass there. He could have taken on GM, the big 3, head on. He decided to create a completely different type of vehicle. Yeah. Yeah. So he basically just said, I don't want to play over here in internal combustion engines. I want to go over here. It's the zigzag approach. And by the way, the big 3 followed him. And now you see what's happening? They're going back to their combustion engines. It's very chaotic right now. Because a lot of people that have EVs, the repeat purchase numbers are not that high for them. And there are issues. They've had issues with battery failure. Lithium batteries my brother's an automotive engineer. He would tell you chapter and verse why lithium batteries were not the best choice for EVs. They are unstable. Yeah. Do you know how they did that? Speaking of GM, that, and also the GM moved its R&D center globally to Shanghai, which some people think wasn't the best idea. But anyway, they did. Now, BYD is actually for the money. It's a good vehicle. It's scaring the Europeans because I think in US dollar equivalent, they've got a one or two models that are like 20 to 25,000 US. Like that's appealing to that buy now, pay later consumer who can't afford, even a BMW Mini. A Mini Cooper those are expensive now for urban mobility. So BYD, I have to say they're doing a pretty good job, but they're going to have problems too because the Europeans are leveling tariffs on that. They've got to protect their automotive sector. Well, Teslas do that too. Yeah. Yeah, that actually comes from a trend spotting company in New York that I worked with years ago, and they had some really good thought starter presentations, and that goes back to I want to say 2014, 15, and one of the examples that stuck out in my mind is rethinking where and how to present your prestige product. So Moet Chandon, the French champagne, Moet Chandon, or it could be any high-end champagne. They did those little splits, that give you one or two drinks out of it. They decided to do vending machines at Selfridges in London and Harrods and a couple other higher end department stores. And that was like a major, major hit. And apparently the management in Paris said, you want to do what with what? And they said, look, we think there's an occasion, a day part, people shopping, mainly women shopping, that want to have a little celebration at the end of their day. And they'll buy splits of Moet Chandon from a vending machine. Those vending machines, I actually saw one of them in London, and they had to keep restocking it because it was just selling out. So the idea of heresy of challenging the consumption occasion for a prestige brand like that and putting in a vending machine. Vending has this downscale. Japan doesn't. Japan, everything is vending over there. But for us in the West, we think vending is just like you get a cheap sandwich out of there or whatever. But they challenged the distribution channel kind of semiotics, if you will. Semiotics is the symbolism of things. And it was a big hit, big success. So it's a good way to challenge your assumptions about where your product should be sold and where it shouldn't be sold. Yeah, that's the best example I can think of.
Just to add a bit of context here, right before this point, I asked Brian about something he calls heritage hearsay. It's his term for when brands try to modernize by abandoning the very DNA that made them great and end up breaking the bond with their core customers. So just wanted to add that for context. All right, let's get back to the conversation. Enjoy.
I think it's trying to be something that you fundamentally are not. So it's like trying to be cool and trying to be modern. I'll give you a good example in branding. The Cracker Barrel debacle. You hear about that? So Cracker Barrel, and having lived in the U.S., Cracker Barrels, and it's not just in Arkansas and places like that. Cracker Barrels have this heritage, this old Americana kind of feeling, grandpa in the rocking chair. Have you ever been in one? The decor is very eclectic. It's got old coffee cans and it's all woodsy. It's a very comfortable, warm environment. And the food, by the way, is very good. But they decided, okay, we need to streamline this, take all the collectible stuff out of the restaurants, redo the logo, retire grandpa, kick him to the old folks home, and try to make it more McDonald's-like, if you will, or even Chipotle-like. I think they were going for Chipotle. Their core consumer just rebelled big time to the point where they had a Reddit channel about Cracker Barrel's rebranding. They actually had consumer groups petitions, bring back grandpa, give us back our Cracker Barrel. And they had to reverse the whole thing. It was very embarrassing for them. So that's the power of the consumer. The consumer has a lot of power that they don't even realize they have. So if your core consumer likes the homespun, old-fashioned, plywood and chicken wire, you better not try to be Chipotle because it'll blow up on you. Yeah. Fashion apparel is another example where apparel companies try to be especially athleisure and, running shoes, trainers, whatever you want to call them. That can be very tricky. A company that I thought would never go places where it's gone is Crocs. A friend of mine works for Crocs. He goes all around the world doing their analytics. But if you look at how Crocs innovates, and, everything from fur-lined Crocs, Crocs jewelry, the kids go crazy for and teens. Crocs is a story of a brand that, like, they're injection molded things on your feet. And they exploited every adjacency that you can imagine. So, like Crocs, white Crocs can be put in a dishwasher. Then they opened up their whole hospital segment for white Crocs that can be kept sterile. What was the thing I saw? They've got Crocs boots now, which, like, Crocs cowboy boots. And actually, they kind of make sense in a way. So they know how to stretch their brand infinitely. They're timeless in a way in that, the basic things of, unique selling proposition, tone and manner is what we used to call it in the for advertising. Key benefits, support, definition of target audience. All those things are still basically the same, even though people will use terms like brand print. Brand equity, obviously, is still the same thing. It's how people do it, how people put it all together, and how they develop campaigns. That's a bit different. It's a good example. Yeah, have you ever seen those bearskin ads online? BAER, those ads are so brilliant. A bearskin is basically a waterproof shell that actually has a zip-in hoodie with it. Those ads are just, they know their target market. By the way, the target market is pretty much exclusively male, but the way they execute that campaign, it's just everybody watches the whole thing through because it's got comical elements, it's stylish. It's not the kind of thing that you would go out looking for. But bearskin is that's a classic ad campaign for apparel that's just best practice all the way through. Yeah, bearskin. Yeah, David, I always say that no two wargamings are the same. And that's true. I mean, whether it's in Shanghai or Paris or Buenos Aires, I've done quite a few down there. What is different is the kind of context, both cultural and strategic. For instance, speaking of Argentina, there's a company in Argentina in the food sector called Arco. Arco is it's almost like we have here in Toronto, we have the Weston companies, right? So they basically have a lock on Longos and Loblaws basically have kind of a lock on food in Toronto. Arco in Argentina, you don't go up against them unless you're ready to fight. Everything from cookies to beverages to main meal things to snacks, whatever. So the tools, techniques, and mind shifts work down there too, but you have different competitive dynamics. For instance, in Argentina, it's interesting. It's a lot like Venezuela. I've also worked in Venezuela, which was an interesting experience. But anyway, people in those cultures, excuse me, on payday, they strive to spend every single peso as soon as it lands in their account. Because with the way hyperinflation is down there, your money is worthless an hour later or worth less an hour later. So the cultures there are spending, and they actually have rooms in their homes that are basically barter rooms. So they'll go out and buy TV sets. They'll go out and buy iPhones. They'll buy food. They'll buy beauty products, and they stash them in these rooms. So when they need to have their car repaired, they don't pay for it in Argentine pesos. They go into the room and they say, okay, this little portable TV is about the same value as a car repair, and they barter. So whereas in Europe and Canada, North America, we're not used to that bartering kind of thing. So that creates a whole different dynamic in terms of your wargaming tactics. It's quite interesting, actually, the cultural nuances. Well, the first and most important thing, David, is to make sure that they've assembled a cross-functional team. You can't do wargaming, at your desk. It's better to go off-site physically, or I guess you could do it in this channel as well. But it's better to be in a room away from the office. Better yet, put your phones in a basket when you walk in and focus on, developing the questions, developing the problem definition. That's an important thing too. You have to define the problem clearly. Otherwise, you'll go off on tangents. for the 2 days, 1 or 2 days. And basically constructing, and we do it usually as table groups, having a diversity of R&D, sales, operations, marketing, whatever, all at the same table, not necessarily from the same business unit. In fact, there's a lot of value. One thing we found out, one that I did in, where was it? It was in Germany. It was in, I think, Munich. We had some people from the R&D unit that were doing food service formulations for people. And at one point, the scientist put up his hand. He said, "We actually sell our spice blends to Nestle for food service." And people were like, "What? We're actually selling our key product design around spices?" And yeah, we sell it to Nestle. It's a good business. They pay a lot for it. And so that one little insight from a R&D person caused the division director to cut off that business. Basically, it was a case of the company helping their own competitor, their enemy, succeed by giving away product design, if you will. That happened all the time, where one left side of the company didn't know what the right was doing. And because you had that venue, that forum to share things, decisions were even taken on the spot. Like, don't give away our secrets to Nestle. Okay, right. That was quite humorous, actually. I would say make every opportunity count and don't waste time on little things that really don't matter. You know, the value, the passion, the inspiration, the creativity, imagination is where the real fun is that makes life worth living. And basically, the other piece of it is no fear. So don't be afraid to make a mistake. Don't be afraid of what your boss's boss is going to do. I have a story about that from many years ago when my little group here in Toronto came up with some ideas, and we wanted to do a white chocolate in the 1980s, just as white chocolate was kind of taking off. And I got this little note left on my desk by the division director saying, "Brian, do yourself a big capital letters, underline, favor and drop this topic." So we decided to go underground and keep developing it. And at one point, the New York, Philip Morris, actually, Philip Morris, who owned Kraft and the whole combined roll up acquisition, they sent up the chairman from Philip Morris who came over to the table, which was all of the chocolate portfolio. And he turns to my boss's boss and says, "Have you ever considered developing a white chocolate product? It's really big in New York right now. All the restaurants have white chocolate mousse, white chocolate enrobed desserts, that type of thing." And he said, "I think we've got something in the works on that." So yeah, that was a vindication. So that's when I say no fear, because like don't let, even if it's somebody senior in the company, be prepared to stand up. Good, even better example in sports is Mad Max last night in Seattle. You see that? The manager, the Blue Jays manager, wanted to take him out of the game. It was the fifth inning, I think. And Max Scherzer said, "No, I'm staying here. It's my ball." And then look at what happened the rest of the game. He pitched his best game ever, and yet the manager was going to pull him out. So, you know, you need, it's called executive courage. You're just having the courage to do something that, you know, it's leadership and courage. Very important. Probably the most important thing. Yeah. Like General Patton, you know, being a General Patton. There was another general that was forgotten that I like to talk about just in deference to him. And his name was Forrestal, General Forrestal. If you ever want to read a great book about leadership, read about him and what happened to him. Forrestal. Yeah. A friend of mine, Thanksgiving weekend, we went to an event, and next morning I had an Amazon box, Disunited Nations. I'm just starting it. Do you know it? Could be. This was my friend's pick, but it's called Disunited Nations. I don't even know who the author was. The one I just finished, I just I like spy novels, so I finished a true to life Soviet defector in the UK. Trying to remember the name of it now. I put it aside to give away to somebody. Maybe I'll give it to you. It's probably the best place. LinkedIn is pretty much the best. I'm also on Telegram, and I'm a big James Bond fan, by the way, so you know my Telegram, right? But otherwise, just email or like LinkedIn's basically the easiest for me. I've got almost 24,000 followers, so I'm happy to speak with people there, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes too much so. But I just posted on, I was pretty early a couple weeks ago in on what happened with this tricolor first brands situation. I lived through 2008 in New York on Wall Street, and this smells exactly the same. So instead of homes with ninja loans and all that, it's cars. And people say, well, the auto sector is much smaller than residential housing. And I say back, well, it's not smaller if they're double and triple pledging the same asset and dragging in the money center banks along with the private capital, private credit. And I think people are starting to see that something potentially big is unfolding. But on the plus side, American Express reported today, have that new mirror card, which is even above the platinum card. American Express had a really, really good quarter. So those who depend on the top 1% consumers, they're doing fine. And that includes private banks, includes, luxury apparel, that type of thing. But everybody under that right now is definitely struggling. So that's what I keep an eye on. And back to your gold and silver. Well, a caveat is I can't give financial advice to people, but I just ask people like open your eyes and look at what's going on around you, and you'll come up with your own advice. Yeah. Thanks, David, very much. I enjoyed it a lot. 2 hours went by very quickly, and I look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you for this opportunity again. Okay. Take care. Have a great weekend, David. Thank you. Thanks, everyone watching. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Even with my side of the recording missing, Brian delivered an absolute masterclass on strategic clarity, brand leadership, and how great companies think under pressure. If you found this valuable, please follow the show wherever you're listening and please share it with your friends. We've got more conversations like this coming up, deep, practical, and built for people who think about business at a systems level. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.